Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar hosted by the 21st Century China Center at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. I'm Susan Shirk. I'm the chair of the 21st Century China Center, and it's my great honor and pleasure to welcome Ambassador Nirupama Rao to speak with us this evening. Ambassador Rao has had a very distinguished career as an Indian diplomat. She has been foreign secretary as well as ambassador to the United States and China and Sri Lanka. She is a very accomplished person who is also a historian and writing a book right now about the history of China and India during the period 1949 to 1962. She's a musician. I enjoyed listening to her recording this afternoon. You can find it. She's a poet, and she and her husband have created a South Asian symphony of South Asian musicians from around the world, and of course from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal as well. So, and as an expert on China, and I know that she has a deep understanding of China and of course of India. I met her a year ago when she visited campus and was a Pacific Leadership Fellow at our school. And today, she's going to speak with us about the current crisis between China and India, how we got to this point, and where we're headed. So I have a few questions for her, but I think we'll let her make some introductory remarks and then we'll have some question and answer. And for all of you participating in the conversation, please do post your questions on the Q&A function, and then I will try to give Ambassador Rao the opportunity to answer as many of your questions as possible. So thanks so much for being with us, Ambassador Rao. We look forward to hearing your perspective on the situation.
Thank you so much, Professor Shirk, and thank you to the 21st Century Center for China at UCSD for hosting me at this webinar today to speak about the relationship, the current relationship between India and China, which is at an inflection point. I'm going to briefly introduce the topic. The basic crisis has arisen between our two countries who are neighbors. We share a frontier, a boundary of about 2,200 miles, which is a very long land boundary, and it's an unresolved boundary. We don't have a jointly determined boundary between the two countries, which is the source of the problem. Now, what happened was to ignite the crisis this year was that we had a confrontation, a bloody confrontation between troops of the two sides in an area of the boundary, which is in the west, the western sector of the boundary, in a place called the Galvan Valley. I'm sure you've heard about it in press reports. And we had a confrontation, a very, very violent confrontation between troops of the two sides, which led to the death of 20 Indian soldiers, including the officer who was leading them. We don't know the casualties on the Chinese side. They never release or disclose these details, but we understand that unofficially that there were a number of casualties on the Chinese side also. The situation along what we call the line of actual control, since we don't have a jointly determined boundary, we have a line of actual control between the two sides. And in this western sector of the boundary, which is in an area called Ladakh. And the Ladakh region is a part of what all of you know as the Kashmir area, which you are also aware is contested with Pakistan. So we have a kind of a problem where we have Pakistan, of course, we have India, and we have China involved in this contest over territory. But what I'm referring to at the moment, this problem is entirely with China. So Pakistan is not involved in this problem that we've had. That I told you in the Galwan Valley and along the line of actual control with China. So this line of actual control, the LAC as we call it, is not again jointly defined between the two countries. The Indian side knows where the line of actual control is, and the Chinese side claim that they know where the line of actual control is. But there are about 23 points or so along this line of actual control, which on which perceptions differ between the two countries, and that's where the problem arises. So the Chinese come into what we say is our side of the line of actual control, and that's actually happened during the summer from April, May onwards. So what the two sides are doing now is to try and disengage. They have had 28 rounds of discussions between military commanders and at the diplomatic level, including between the foreign ministers of the two countries. And from time to time, we hear that progress is being made. Winter is approaching, temperatures fall, they're around 27 degrees Fahrenheit below zero, in fact, minus. And it can be extremely cold and it's forbidding terrain. And I sincerely hope that we'll be able to arrive at some disengagement. The Indian side is insisting that the status quo must be restored. So, what went wrong? Why do you think this has happened between the two countries? First of all, as I said, we have an unresolved boundary. You know that the Chinese contest the McMahon line, which is in the east of the boundary, and they dispute the right of Tibet to have signed any such agreement with British India way back in 1914. And the Chinese have contested the legality of that agreement, as you know, for a long time. So we have a huge chunk of territory in the eastern side of the border, which China claims. And in the western sector, where this problem I referred to just arose this summer, uh, the Chinese occupy, India says, the Chinese occupy a considerable area of territory, about 14,000 square miles of territory in this area that we call Ladakh. You know, they built a road in this area in the 50s, the Aksai Chin Highway, which basically connects Xinjiang with Tibet, and it runs across the Aksai Chin Plateau, which is claimed by India, but which is currently occupied by China. But what has happened is over the years, this line of actual control has, in a sense, changed. The Indians claim that the Chinese have advanced further westward, further and further westward, much beyond the road that they built into Indian territory. And that's been the source of the problem. This is where also we had the conflict in 1962, apart from in other areas of the boundary. But after the war happened in 1962, and there was a kind of deep freeze in relations, diplomatic relations were restored at the ambassadorial level in the mid 70s. And then efforts were ongoing to see how we could restore normalcy to the relationship. And I think both countries succeeded to a large extent. In 1988, we had our kind of Nixonian moment in the relationship when the then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi visited China, met Deng Xiaoping, and decisions were made that both countries would develop relations in other areas apart from the boundary question, which had remained unresolved, as I said, while efforts would continue to be made to negotiate a boundary settlement. And those efforts have been ongoing in various sort of exercises, various efforts since 1981. The most recent effort being the negotiations between the special representatives of the two countries appointed by the leaders of India and China to see how we can resolve the boundary question. And in 2005, there was an agreement in principle that was an agreement on guiding principles and political parameters to resolve the boundary question. And one of those principles was that efforts would be made to kind of jointly determine the line of actual control between the two countries. But unfortunately, that exercise did not go anywhere. The Chinese side has basically refused to continue discussions to define the line of actual control, even as discussions to resolve the boundary have been ongoing, not with much success, but at least that effort has continued. But as far as delineating the line of actual control is concerned, there's not been much progress. And the Chinese side has said very bluntly that they don't intend to carry that forward. And the problem, there have been terrible problems that have arisen as a result, the most recent, of course, being the one in Galwan. And why Galwan stands out and why it is an inflection point is because for 45 years, since 1975, we had no incident involving loss of life on this boundary along the line of actual control. In fact, we would always say not a single shot had been fired on the LAC. But all that has changed, and today we have a great deal of tension. There's been troops build up on both sides, and that atmosphere of tension hasn't eased as yet. And this is despite the fact that since 1993 we had 5 agreements, protocols, mechanisms to maintain peace and tranquility in these areas and to build confidence. And they had maintained the peace all these years, but all that has virtually broken down now, and we will have to see how we can mend this relationship. And it's virtually collapsed, I would say, by virtue of the fact that we had this violent confrontation. And what this experience has demonstrated is a lack of resilience in the relationship. We've had effects of that being felt in the field of trade. India has banned 59 Chinese apps, including TikTok. And we obviously will not be going ahead with involving the Chinese in, especially in areas of involving national security like telecommunications, where they had been involved with 3G and 4G. As far as 5G is concerned, we don't see any Chinese involvement. And also in areas where, there will be we feel that data security is being compromised. We have a great deal of dependence on China that's grown up over the last 3 decades in the field of trade, a huge trade deficit, apart from the fact that for a country like India, for which the pharmaceutical industry is hugely important, most of the active pharmaceutical ingredients for the industry are being sourced from China. About 30, 25 years ago, if we'd had this conversation, that would not have been the situation. Many of these APIs were being manufactured in India. So like it happened in the United States, much of our manufacturing industry was weakened, attenuated with this growing dependence on China. Why has this confrontation along the line of actual control happened? There's not one single factor. The Chinese say it's the infrastructure factor that has contributed to it. India has been improving its infrastructure in these border areas, just as the Chinese have done over many decades now. There's some attributed to the changes that were made when Article 370 of the Constitution ceased to apply to Jammu and Kashmir from August last year. And the Union Territory of Ladakh was created together with the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir. Earlier, they were all part of one state. So the state was kind of reorganized into 2 union territories. And when the new map of that region was published, the Chinese protested about it. And we said there had been no change in the external boundaries, so there was really no cause for them to protest. As you know, the Chinese and the Pakistanis are extremely close. They're iron brothers. And the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor runs through occupied Kashmiri territory, occupied by Pakistan, and in the area of Gilgit-Baltistan and then into the rest of the country. So we are very concerned about it, and that's a cause of difference between India and China. We are very concerned about that too. And we had the crisis in Doklam in Bhutan in 2017, where Indian and Chinese troops confronted each other. You're aware of the tensions from that particular period. We were able to resolve it, but obviously the aftermath of that crisis resonated across the relationship. And there are some analysts who say that the Chinese were very, very riled up about what happened in Doklam, and that had its impact also on the border situation with India. But the fact is that the Chinese have increasingly come to stress issues of sovereignty and territory. As you know, all across the board, you've seen what happens in the South China Sea, the East China Sea. All in all, it's a much more assertive, much more muscular, and much more powerful China that India is dealing with. There is power asymmetry between our two countries. 30 years ago, our GDPs were at the same, almost at the same level, and you've seen the way China has accelerated ahead. It's number two in the world, literally, trying to catch up with the United States. In South Asia, China is a very, very looming presence today. It has deep pockets, it's building projects, and and the countries in the region are the mounting debt vis-a-vis China, as you know, with Sri Lanka, Pakistan, of course, I've just mentioned the Maldives. So there is a very changed scenario as far as India and China are concerned in the region, and all across what we today call the Indo-Pacific, which is a Trump administration term for the region, which has essentially been adopted when we look at the region today. And it's drawn, the crisis with China has drawn India and the United States much closer. We always talk about the partnership between our two democracies being a natural partnership. And today, as your defense secretary, Mr. Esper, spoke the other day, it's become a very consequential partnership. We've just had a meeting of the 2+2 between India and the United States. That's the defense secretary and the secretary of state of the United States and the defense minister and the foreign minister of India. They've just met in Delhi. They've again spoken about a vision for a free and inclusive and prosperous and secure in Indo-Pacific, which essentially obviously also takes into account the China factor, the rise of China and the concerns in the region about the muscular, assertive China that we see today. India has always prided itself on its strategic autonomy. As you know, we don't use the word non-alignment, but we do say, we talk about strategic autonomy. We are not into alliances. We don't have an alliance with the United States, and I don't believe the United States is looking for an alliance with India. But there's a much closer alignment of interests between India and the United States. If you ask India what it seeks for the region, I think we would like a balanced multipolarity when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. We don't want imbalances. We don't want a disturbance of the equilibrium. We would like a rule-based order for the region, and I think that's what the United States constantly stresses too. You know, there's been the rise of the Quad, basically a rebirth of the quadrilateral security dialogue, which involves Japan, the United States, Australia, and India. They've just had another meeting of their ministers in Tokyo earlier this month. And India has just announced that Australia will also take part in the naval exercises that we call the Malabar Exercises with India, Japan, the United States, and Australia will bring up the fourth. That's going to happen in the Bay of Bengal next month. Obviously, the Chinese tend to be very insecure about these arrangements, and they have railed against this. But But the fact is that their rise in the region and their profile and their actions have raised concerns. And even as we don't say this is directed against China, obviously the concerns that we have with China do define some of the actions that democracies such as ours have sought to take in the region. India, I believe, has strong diplomatic influence in the region, perhaps the defense networks and the economic cooperation networks uh, that we need to develop. There's much more work to be done in that connection. But the United States has designated India as a major defense partner. I mean, that's a kind of bespoke definition for a country that is not an ally, but we do enjoy a lot of privileges as a result in terms of defense cooperation, the sharing of technology. And India has sourced equipment and defense materials worth 20 billion US dollars over the last decade from the United States. And this has been of enormous help. There's also a sharing of intelligence. That we've just signed the fourth foundational agreement that cements this defense and security cooperation. It's called BECA. It was just signed this week, and it enables the sharing of geospatial intelligence, navigational data, and such like between India and the United States. And that certainly works towards interoperability. So there's a very strong foundation for the India-US relationship today. And even, I believe, whatever the outcome of your presidential election will be next week, there will be continuity. There is consensus, bipartisan consensus in the United States about the relationship with India. Just as, confrontation with China has built up, there's an enormous consensus about building a stronger, more resilient relationship between two of our democracies, two of the world's largest democracies. So today we're looking for greater supply chain resilience, even within the Quad. This is one of the things we speak about. We're looking at how we can help countries in the region in terms of infrastructure, in more economic cooperation, helping them understand the need to avoid debt diplomacy that's coming their way from China. As I mentioned, the Chinese are not happy about all that is happening, but there are a lot of other countries that also want to come into the region. You have Britain, you have France, you have Germany. They're all going to be players in the Indo-Pacific. So it's not going to be a club of limited members against the Chinese. But we don't believe what we're doing in the region is in order to take on China in a very kinetic way, but it's only because we want this rule-based global order, and we'd like more transparency and more inclusiveness about what we build for the region, and with keeping in mind the centrality of the ASEAN countries, the Southeast Asian countries. So that really is our vision for the Indo-Pacific: common prosperity, common security, a common rule-based order. And on the side of it, we have this crisis with China. Ultimately, India has to face China across this land border of ours. It's not that we'll have others to fight our battles for us, but we need some external balancing, obviously. And that's where the relationships I spoke about, we'd like to see taking these processes, the taking of these processes further. We wouldn't like the contest with China to become a conflict. The differences, unfortunately, have become disputes now, but I hope both sides can act responsibly. I'd like to also conclude, before I conclude, say that the Indian government has been very restrained and very, very careful about the way in which it has articulated our problems with China in public. If you see, there's an absence of rhetoric. It was very noteworthy, I think, during the press conference, during the 2+2 dialogue, that while Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Esper spoke about China, in very antagonistic terms. There was no mention of the China word in these statements from the defense minister and the foreign minister of India. We did speak about what we want, our vision for the Indo-Pacific and our vision for the India-US relationship and how it resonates in India, how this vision resonates in India. But we didn't really talk about China frame it the way that the representatives of the United States did at that meeting. I'll conclude here and we could discuss this further
Great.
in the rest of the discussion.
Well,
Thank you.
well, thank you so much for uh, this wonderful analysis of the situation from all of its different angles. One dimension that you didn't mention was the connection between domestic politics and the conflict or the between China and India over the line of actual control. So as a China expert, um, why do you think that at this time, Xi Jinping, the Chinese leadership, and the government kind of picked a fight with India? That's my characterization, just to be provocative. I don't, but it does seem to fit in with a number of other actions recently, especially in the post-COVID months, post-COVID in China, not necessarily post-COVID in America or in India, where China's foreign policy behavior has been even more assertive. We have the wolf warrior diplomacy uh, and some provocative behavior with Japan, South China Sea, Taiwan, pressure on Taiwan. How do you see the actions vis-a-vis India fitting into that picture, or do you think it's completely on a separate track?
Well, I don't believe it's on a separate track, and there are a lot of there is a kind of a relativity theory that you can apply, I think, to all these situations. The problem with India, of course, the territorial issue, the boundary differences between India and China are of long standing. And we've had similar transgressions from the Chinese side for many years across the line of actual control. But this time around, I think the scale of the assertiveness and the extent of ingress and the kind of military power that they have consolidated in areas along the line of actual control makes it very different from past situations, because we've had similar face-offs, but without violence, and they had been diffused much more quickly, and that we didn't have a crisis of such a prolonged nature ever before for many decades between India and China. And I think it's all related to this emphasis within China about sovereignty, about not giving up an inch of territory, about being able to exert their newly found power. And I mean, this is something that we have seen, and I had noticed even from before the Xi Jinping years. In fact, around 2008, 2009, at the time of the global financial crisis, when within the Chinese Foreign Ministry also, I saw this newfound assertiveness about disputes with India. You have the territory, the state of Arunachal Pradesh, which is essentially that sector which is covered by the McMahon line alignment of the border. And they would, talk about, they would protest about the World Bank doing development projects in the area, raise a huge protest about these questions, give visas on separate pieces of paper to people born in Arunachal Pradesh who wanted to visit in China. So many such issues were coming up more and more with much greater frequency for around 10 years. But in the Xi Jinping era, this has become much more pronounced, as you have seen with Japan, as you have seen in the South China Sea with all the island disputes, with what China has been doing in terms of building infrastructure. It's one rule that seems to apply for them and something else for others. So they don't play, obviously, by any rule except, follow their own power projection plans and stratagems in all these areas. So in a sense, they're all connected. So we're dealing with one country and with one system of power projection here, I think.
So, is India prepared to play a military role in the South China Sea? Uh, India, I think, already has sent some naval vessels into the South China Sea. I'm wondering if there's a possibility of things moving into the maritime domain, the conflict between India and China.
Well, I perhaps wouldn't frame it within a definition of conflict between India and China in the maritime domain, but India's unique position in the Indian Ocean, I think geography has endowed India with a great deal of resources. We have a very forbidding, formidable mountain border to the north of the country, the Himalayas, as you know. But the south of the country, we have the peninsula, the peninsular India. The city where I am, where I'm speaking from, is part of peninsular India. And we have, a coastline which is 4,700 miles long. And it includes the island territories of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and the Lakshadweep Islands. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands are that part of India. I always like to say that India is not just a South Asian country, it's also a Southeast Asian country, because the Andaman and Nicobar Islands border the Indonesian archipelago. We're just a heartbeat away from Indonesia when you look at the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So we have these unique geographical resources that can become geopolitical advantages for India and are fast becoming so. So the Indian Navy is demonstrating its capability in the seas around us and beyond. We're looking at building closer relations with the island countries on the east coast of Africa, for instance, with Mauritius, with Seychelles, with Madagascar, and in Southeast Asia, with Vietnam, with Indonesia, the dialogue has been strengthening, and we are doing, for instance, with the United States, we do more military and naval exercises than perhaps with any other country today. So that's the scale of the relationships that are being built up in the maritime domain. So maritime domain awareness, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, freedom of navigation operations, all these form a part of the actions that we're looking at. So yes, the maritime environment of the Indo-Pacific is becoming hugely important in the strategies for the Indo-Pacific.
So let's turn to some of these great questions that are coming on my screen. One person asks, it looks like India has made a major decision to give up the non-alignment policy or the strategic autonomy approach. And that's a huge thing. I mean, if in fact this is what we're watching happen as the American secretaries of defense and state are there, and India's signing agreements on intelligence sharing, participating in the Quad. I mean, this is a very different style of Indian foreign policy than we've seen in the past. So is it really the China threat or perceived threat that is driving this change, or do you think it's only a temporary kind of tactical adjustment and won't be long lasting?
I don't believe that it's entirely a tactical stratagem. Secondly, I would say there is a China factor. And thirdly, I believe that the steps that have been taken over the last decade, decade and a half to build this, what we call a comprehensive global strategic partnership with the United States, is contributing a great deal to these new alignments that you're seeing in the region. Now,
Mm-hmm.
if you were to ask an Indian government representative, they'll probably tell you that we haven't given up strategic autonomy,
Uh-huh.
really. India takes its own independent decisions, and we're looking at plurilateral, systems of diplomacy. We're looking at we stress multilateralism. We talk about multipolarity. So all these terms constantly come up in the conversation. But I believe that you're looking at a new pattern of relationships that will involve much more emphasis on defense and security tie-ups and partnerships with like-minded countries, and that's essentially what India is doing within the Quad, within the 2+2 with the United States. And as I said, regardless of what administration is in charge after the elections in the United States, there will be a continuum in these processes and in these trends that you see. And it's got a lot to do with the rise of China. Yes, so therefore, strategic autonomy, in a sense, is being redefined. But let me also add that while you have the Quad today, a few years earlier, when you had the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of the hyperpower of the United States, India, China, and Russia formed a grouping called the Russia, India, China, the RIC trilateral, which continues to meet even after the crisis in Galvan. There was a meeting of the Russia, India, China group of foreign ministers, and Russia, has continues to be a country with which India has a fairly strong partnership even today, because much of our defense equipment within the Indian defense forces continues to be sourced from Russia, and we'll have to see how all this is going to balance out in the near and midterm.
It's extremely interesting because when they first changed the Pacific Command to the Indo-Pacific Command and talked about the free and open Indo-Pacific, a lot of foreign policy experts in the United States have had a big debate
Yes.
about whether or not this whole vision would really be successful, and especially in bringing India on board with it because of this long time independence, kind of strategic independence of India. But, I suppose one argument could be made that the Chinese leadership made a significant mistake in provoking, or maybe I don't know who actually provoked the fight, but in participating in the conflict right now on the line of actual control, which just spurred India to maybe, go even further than it might otherwise have gone in cooperating so closely with the United States, Australia, and Japan in the Quad. So, but it'll be interesting to see how this evolves in the future. How do you think, one question is, how do you think Chinese leaders perceive India as a regional competitor? And do they perceive India as an inferior regional competitor? And has that perception played a role in China's actions along the border?
Well, I think on both sides, when you talk of both India and China, they've had a long-standing relationship. They've kind of rubbed up against each other for centuries, but we by and large had a peaceful relationship. That's the history of the interaction between India and China. And we saw each other as civilizational equals. I mean, both, as you know, both India and China are kind of mother loads of civilization for the rest of Asia. I mean, we don't perhaps say that in too strident a way, but the influences are there to be seen across the region, the historical civilizational influences. I think in modern times, yes, the Chinese have always, let's look at in terms of strategic, the focus of China has essentially, the primary theater of strategic focus has been the the eastern coastline of China, the whole of Northeast Asia, what happens, in the maritime environment, the first island chain, the second island chain. So India is a kind of a secondary strategic theater, the land border between China and India. That's how China has looked at it. As far as India is concerned, I think we've always looked at China as that country which is equal in size to ours, uh, where India has as much of a great future ahead for it on the global stage as the Chinese perceive for themselves. But the Chinese perhaps look at this differently. They've grown so significantly in the last couple of decades. They've begun to realize the full weight of the power and influence that this growth has brought them. And that introduces an asymmetry in relations between India and China and the way China looks at India. But in South Asia, when you look at the region around India and of which India is a part, I think the Chinese are definitely coming into this area to kind of off balance India, to try and disturb the equilibrium. And here they see India as the main, rival, the main, competitor. So I think again there are relative the environments in which this concept of rivalry and competition operate can be different, as we have seen.
So this leads to the question about Pakistan, because a number of people ask a question of what role is Pakistan playing in the uh, the conflict or the dispute between India and China, the territorial and the general rivalry between the two.
Well, the first point to make is that in this current crisis that you're seeing between India and China, which has kind of been acted out in the last few months, uh, Pakistan is not, actually a player in that confrontation or in that tension or in the crisis that you're seeing today. It's essentially between India and China. But if you look at the larger dispute, yes, to the west of the line of actual control, beyond the Karakoram Pass, you have territory that is currently occupied by Pakistan, in which China is an active player. So there is that sense of the dispute being trilateralized as a result. And as I mentioned, China's activities in CPEC introduce a further dimension to this problem. Now, when Article 370 was revoked as far as Kashmir was concerned last August 2019, as you know, the Chinese protested and the Pakistanis protested too about what the changes that had been made. And China, Pakistan and China obviously confabulated together about what next steps to take on the situation. And China sought a meeting of the Security Council to discuss this issue. And this is the first time that the Kashmir issue was being taken to that body in years, in decades, in fact. Of course, that effort didn't go any far, which speaks to the fact that issues like Kashmir cannot be internationalized any longer in the current scenario, and not, with the changes in alignments that have taken place as far as relationships between the US and China are concerned, or between US and India are concerned. And therefore, that effort didn't go anywhere. But if you were to ask me, is China a neutral player in the dispute between India and Pakistan? I would would have to answer that question in the negative, because today it's not a neutral player. And A, the relationship with Pakistan is so much closer than it was before, the relationship between China and Pakistan. And, the growing tensions on the border between India and China, uh, you know, reduce the possibility of China being a neutral player in this dispute, the larger dispute with Pakistan anymore. But
So,
I wouldn't. May I also say I wouldn't say that this would essentially imply that there is an impending situation where China and Pakistan together are going to join forces in a conflict situation with India. I don't see that as an impending or a ensuing result of these trends that you witness.
well, what about this new missile agreement? David Carl asks, this new missile agreement with the United States is going to enable greater accuracy by Indian long-range missiles. How does Pakistan feel about that as it attempts to safeguard its nuclear assets? So do you anticipate some reaction from Pakistan?
I don't believe there have been any missile agreements between India and the US. And as far as the nuclear issue is concerned, as India is a nuclear weapon power. The United States and India concluded a civilian nuclear power deal, as you know, and they signed the agreement in 2008. But that's got to do with the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. But essentially, it involved in recognition of, by the United States, of India as a responsible power in the region that was not that was capable of assuming these responsibilities, also in the nuclear field. So that's got nothing to really do with Pakistan. Pakistan, of course, obviously is concerned about the growing closeness between India and the United States, and the China factor, weighs very heavily in all this. But the I don't believe that what we are doing with the United States is directed against Pakistan.
I guess maybe what is BECA?
Oh, the Becca. That is the foundational agreement that we signed this week, which
Okay,
enables the sharing of geospatial intelligence and navigational data between India and the United States for weapon systems. But we're not talking about, nuclear.
okay, so it's not a new missile, it simply enables them to be more accurate in their targeting. Okay.
But that's
Um,
between India and the United States, the weapon systems that the United States and India share together, or work on together, operate together.
um, some other people are asking about India's exclusion of Chinese tech firms, and asking whether or not India is moving closer to an outright ban on all Chinese 5G suppliers in the construction of India's 5G network. Do you anticipate that will happen?
Well, I do anticipate that there will be a ban on Chinese tech companies participating in 5G networks, and there's a
Yeah.
whole issues of national security involved there, especially since China is seen as an adversary.
Okay. Um, so how will India actually be enforcing the ban on TikTok and other um, Chinese telecom companies?
Well, TikTok has been banned, and we had millions of TikTok users in India, and the app is no longer available on the smartphones that millions of Indians have. It's just been taken off. It doesn't operate in India. Just as when you go to China, you can't operate Facebook or WhatsApp
Uh-huh.
or Twitter. It's like that. It's just been taken off the systems.
Just take it up. So how did the Indian TikTok users react to this?
I think that, just as all across the world, there's a great deal of a nationalist sort of wave among the population. And when the tragedy at Galwan happened, I think there was an outcry all across the nation, uh, very anti-Chinese, and there were protests, and people were ready to give up these things. I didn't see any protest being registered. In fact, people were okay with it.
So can we infer from that that Prime Minister Modi is being restrained? You said he's being quite restrained in not beating the drum publicly against China, but is he benefiting domestically from the tension with China?
Prime Minister Modi continues to be enormously popular within the country, and he has a huge following, and people trust him, and he has a great deal of credibility as far as the Indian electorate is concerned. So his handling, I mean, he's spoken about, without referring to China, some of his speeches do refer to India being against expansionism, that India being willing to fight aggression, India is standing firm on the defense of its territory. So all those things, of course, appeal a great deal to the people, and they have a great deal of confidence in him and his ability to handle the situation. But yes, on the diplomatic front, on in the public space, you know, the rhetoric has been quite restrained. It would have been, I believe, I mean, I hate to bring in this comparison, but let's say a similar situation with Pakistan had occurred between India and Pakistan. Last year, you had, the confrontation in February, if you remember, an Indian pilot was shot down by Pakistan and then returned to India. Indian planes attacked a Pakistani terror camp in Balakot. You're aware of that. So the kind of reaction in India, the speeches by political leaders, they all, were extremely, the tempo, the decibel levels were much louder when it came to naming Pakistan. But with China, I think there's been a lot of maturity and restraint, I believe, in expressing views about the crisis and differences with China. I
Hmm.
think, in a sense, you talked about history. I think you learn a lot also from history because, when the crisis happened in the 50s and everything, the decibel levels just went up so quickly after the Dalai Lama came to India in 1959, and you had a few, kinetic confrontations between India and China along the border, and Parliament, erupted. The space for Nehru, Prime Minister Nehru, to deal with the situation, just the oxygen levels just went down. It was just not possible to enter into any negotiation with China after that. So I think the manner in which it's been handled today uh, suggests that you learn from that kind of experience
Hmm.
and understand the complexity and the nature of the dispute. At one point, in the history of this problem, India was not even prepared to concede that there was a dispute with China. India was always saying that we know where our border is, it's all settled. There are few little pockets here and there we can talk about to the Chinese, but that's that. But today, I think it's very different. There's much more realism and much more appreciation of the complexity and the nature of this dispute and the fact that it's going to take time to resolve.
So last question is, do you think the current conflict is narrowly driven by the border dispute, or if they manage to resolve or stabilize the border dispute through negotiations now, do you think that the larger geopolitical or geoeconomic competition, rivalry will continue to kind of make this a very competitive relationship that will be a rivalry and You know, even if the border dispute is temporarily resolved, or not resolved, but just calmed down.
Well, at the moment, I think the relationship is profoundly disturbed, as our foreign
Mhm.
minister said, because of the crisis on the border. And I believe the differences over the boundary and the lack of resolution of this problem overshadows other areas of the interaction between India and China, and will continue to do so. Now, let's assume that the current crisis de escalates and there's disengagement. Well, to some extent, I think the situation will then be brought under control. But a lack of resolution on the boundary question, will continue to cause problems between India and China. We don't even have a jointly decided line of actual control between the two countries. So there is need, and today we have very strong leaders both in China and in India. You have Xi Jinping, you have Prime Minister Modi. They are strong leaders. They enjoy, at least I know when Mr. Modi is concerned, enjoys a great deal of support within the country. And President Xi is also, he's very much numero uno. He's very much believed to be in control of the system. It's a very different China under Xi Jinping. So can these two leaders sit down and resolve this question, which has defied resolution for so long, is the question. I believe the opportunity exists today. Windows have opened and closed so many times in this dispute for 70 years now. Will it be resolved ultimately now? I really don't know. I really hope that there is some possibility of an agreement coming out of all this crisis that you see before your eyes today. Will the rivalry persist between the two countries? I believe that when you have two big countries neighboring each other of this nature, there is possibility of partnership in certain areas. There's so many, sectors in which we obviously can cooperate and can continue to cooperate perhaps between India and China, whether it's in the area of health or development or
Climate. That's my dream.
yes, and climate. So it's not that we can't find common ground, as the Chinese they love to use that term. We can't find common ground in many of these areas. But until and unless we're able to resolve these differences along our common land border, and the imbalances that have arisen out of the relationship between China and Pakistan, which also have cast their shadows on this relationship, I don't believe that this element of rivalry can really be reduced. It will continue to some extent. There will always be competition, but there are possibilities of greater cooperation if these problems are addressed.
Well, thank you so much. I certainly learned a lot from the discussion, and I hope everyone else did as well. And we at the School of Global Policy and Strategy look forward to the time that we'll welcome you back to campus, and we'll all be able to travel again, and we can continue the discussion right in San Diego. So thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for participating. This conversation has been recorded and it will be available on YouTube soon after this evening. I'm not sure exactly how fast, but you'll be able to share it with other people on YouTube. So thanks once again. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Professor, and
Okay.
thank you to the 21st Century China Center for hosting me today and giving
Well,
me this opportunity. Thank you
it
so
was
much.
it was great. We look forward to more cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, and stay
Okay.
safe.
Bye, everyone. Good night.
Bye-bye.